The sound the room made wasn't loud. That's what I remember most. 400 people, and the noise they made when my husband's hand connected with my face was a kind of collective intake. Not a gasp, not a shout, just air being pulled backward through 400 mouths at once. Then nothing. Then one person laughed. Then 3 more. Then the whole table nearest the stage, and I was still standing there with my hand not yet raised to my cheek, the sting not yet fully arrived, looking out at the white tablecloths and the centerpieces and the faces of people I had spent 6 years trying to impress. I pressed 2 fingers to my cheekbone. Something went cold in my chest. Not shame, not grief, something older and more specific, like a mechanism finally releasing after years of pressure. I reached into my clutch, found my phone, and walked off the stage. The anniversary banner, Marcus and Nora 6 years, swayed once from the displaced air as I passed beneath it. I found a hallway behind the kitchen. The smell of catered beef and dish soap. A fire door propped open with a rubber wedge. I stood near it and dialed. He picked up on the second ring. "Dad," I said. "Please come. My name is Nora Voss-Calloway." I was 34 years old that night, a licensed property assessor with Harmon County, and I had been trying for 6 years to be the kind of woman the Calloway family would accept. I grew up in Findlay, Ohio, in a house on Creston Mill Road with a father who drove a mud-caked pickup and never once wore a tie to anything I can remember. Raymond Voss. People in Harmon County knew the name. I didn't understand why until I was much older, and by the time I understood it, I had already learned not to mention it because mentioning it felt like borrowing something that wasn't mine to borrow. He kept records the way some men kept tools, not for display, filed in a canvas bag behind the truck seat, manila folders with brass brads that he never explained and I never thought to ask about. I met Marcus Calloway at a county assessors conference in Columbus. He was there representing his father's development group. He was handsome in the careful way of men who have been told so their entire lives, and he listened when I talked, which I later understood was a skill he performed rather than a habit he had. We dated for 14 months. He proposed in a restaurant. I said yes while thinking distantly that my father would have preferred a porch. Gerald Calloway, Marcus's father, shook my hand at the first family dinner and said, "So you're the one from Findlay," the way someone might say, "So you're the one with the rash." He smiled when he said it. He always smiled. That was the thing about Gerald that took me years to properly understand. The cruelty lived entirely in the assumptions, never the vocabulary. He was never rude. He was just perpetually, warmly certain that I was less. Marcus's mother, Diane, was quieter. She passed dishes and said, "Of course, dear," to most things and looked at me sometimes with an expression I couldn't read. Not unkind, not anything I could name. I told myself first impressions were first impressions. I told myself I was building something. What I built, across those 6 years, was considerable. I won't catalog it the way a ledger would, dates and figures and line items, because that isn't what it was. It was the sustained, unremarkable work of someone who believed the effort would eventually be legible. I covered gaps when Marcus's development deals stalled, which they did with a regularity that Gerald always explained away as the market's fault. I kept the household accounts when Marcus's attention drifted from them. I took on extra assessment contracts to carry us through the 18 months when the Calloway Group's financing restructured and Marcus's draw from the family business dropped to near nothing. I learned Gerald's preferences. He took his coffee with exactly 1 sugar and didn't like to be contradicted at his own table, and if you brought something to that table, an idea, a concern, an observation, you brought it sideways, embedded in agreement, or you didn't bring it at all. I learned this. I adapted. Not because I admired it, but because I was building something and I believed the building required it. There were other things, smaller and quieter, that I did without being asked and without marking as anything significant. Phone calls made on Marcus's behalf to county offices I knew well. Applications reviewed before submission. A reference letter shaped carefully for a planning board position Marcus had pursued for 2 years without traction. The kind of work that leaves no trail because the person doing it never thinks to document it, because doing it is not the point. The point is that it works, and it did work for a long time, and I thought that was its own kind of record. I renovated the sunroom in the Calloway family home on Creston Mill Road, the house Marcus had inherited partial interest in from his grandfather. I did the trim work myself over 3 weekends because the contractor Gerald hired quoted a number that would have taken us 4 months to recover from. My knuckles were raw for a week. Gerald looked at the finished room and said it was coming along. Marcus's career, what there was of it by the 5th year, ran on the reputation I quietly maintained with county contacts. Assessment work was dry, specific, unglamorous, and it put you in the room with people who held property decisions in their hands. I was in those rooms. I made those connections careful and deliberate. When Marcus needed an introduction to a planning board member, I had one. When he needed a reference from someone the county respected, I provided it without being asked and without saying so afterward. Gerald, for his part, referred to my work at family dinners as Nora's little county job. He said it warmly. He always said everything warmly. Marcus, in those moments, would refill his wine glass. The anniversary dinner was Gerald's idea. He announced it 6 weeks out, 400 guests, Dellwood Banquet Hall, a catered event with a stage and a microphone and a program printed on cream cardstock. 6 years is worth celebrating, he told Marcus, and Marcus agreed the way he agreed with most things his father proposed, which was immediately and without apparent consideration of whether I had been consulted. I wore a dress I had owned for 2 years and finally had occasion to wear. I sat at the head table between Marcus and Gerald's business partner, a man named Holt who talked about square footage for 40 minutes. Diane sat across from me. Gerald sat at Marcus's left, holding court. He began at the salad course. "Nora," he said pleasantly, "I understand you've been advising Marcus on the Linden property question." I gave him some information about the county assessment process, I said. He asked. Of course he did. Gerald smiled at the table generally. It's good to have a wife who works in county offices. Very practical. I said nothing. Though I do sometimes wonder, he continued, cutting his salad into very precise pieces, whether the county's assessment on that Linden parcel reflects actual value or just the assessor's familiarity with the applicant. He looked up. Professionally speaking. There it was. Not an accusation. An implication wearing a question's clothing. The assessment was conducted by my supervisor, I said. I disclosed the connection and recused myself. It's in the file. I'm sure it is, Gerald said. I'm sure it's all very proper. He smiled at Marcus. She's thorough. I'll give her that. Marcus refilled his wine glass. By the main course, Gerald had moved on to the sunroom renovation, explaining to Holt that he'd had some work done on the Creston Mill house. When Holt asked about it, Gerald described the project in a way that positioned himself as the decision-maker and the contractor, the one he hadn't hired as the executor. I was not mentioned. I kept my hands in my lap and watched Diane watch her plate. It was during the speeches that things shifted. Gerald took the microphone first. He spoke about Marcus, his ambition, his vision, the Calloway name, and what it represented in Harmon County. He spoke for 7 minutes. He mentioned me once, near the end, and of course Nora has been along for the ride. The room applauded. I stood when Marcus gestured for me to join him at the microphone. I had not prepared anything. I had assumed naively that this was a dinner and not a performance review. I just like to say, I started, that 6 years is a long time to build something together. And I think what we've built is worth. Nora. Gerald's voice, not into a microphone but loud enough. He was still seated. Let's not make it about the property portfolio. Laughter. Actual laughter, from people who didn't know what had been said exactly but understood the shape of it. Wife corrected by father-in-law, publicly, warmly. I said, I wasn't talking about property. Of course not, Gerald said. Though perhaps you should have been, given what you actually contributed. He paused, just one beat. It's a shame when an opportunity for gratitude becomes an opportunity for something else. Something else, I repeated. Marcus has worked very hard, Gerald said. The family has invested considerably. I only mean that some people have longer memories than others. Gerald, I said, and my voice was even, I laid the trim in that sunroom with my own hands. I carried that household for 18 months while Marcus's draw was suspended. I built every county relationship that got Marcus into those planning meetings. So if you're tallying contributions at this table, I'll wait while you finish your count. The room went quiet the way rooms do when the temperature drops without anyone touching the thermostat. Gerald looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, quietly but not privately, ungrateful. Just the one word. I beg your pardon? I said. You heard me. All of this, he gestured vaguely at the room at the banner at the evening, and still. Ungrateful. I opened my mouth. Marcus stepped in front of me. And then his hand moved and the room made that sound, that collective backward breath, and my cheek registered heat before I fully understood what had happened. The laugh came from somewhere near table 7. Then more. I pressed 2 fingers to my cheekbone. I said nothing. I walked off the stage. The kitchen hallway smelled of catered beef and dish soap. I stood near the propped fire door for a moment and listened to the noise from the banquet hall normalize behind me. Music resuming, conversation filling back in, the sound of an event deciding to continue without incident. I set my clutch on a stainless steel cart. I opened it. I took out my phone. I dialed my father. I said, Dad, please come. I put the phone back. I picked up my clutch. I walked to the women's restroom at the end of the corridor. I ran cold water over my wrist for 30 seconds. I dried my hands on a paper towel. I folded the paper towel in half and placed it in the bin. I walked back to the hallway. I sat on a folding chair someone had left against the wall and looked at the fire door and waited. At 9:14 p.m. on a Saturday, Raymond Voss walked through the front entrance of Dellwood Banquet Hall. I knew he had arrived because I heard the room change before I saw him. Not loudly. Just a shift in register. Conversations that had been running at one pitch dropped half a step, the way a room adjusts when someone enters who recalibrates the atmosphere without saying a word. I came out of the hallway and found him near the entrance, still in his work clothes. Canvas jacket, clean boots, the only concession to formality being that he'd tucked his shirt in. He was 61 years old and looked like a man who had spent those years outdoors, and he looked at my face once with an expression that didn't change but went very still, and then he nodded once. Show me, he said. We walked to the head table. Gerald was mid-sentence when he saw my father, and something happened behind his eyes. A very small rearrangement, gone before it fully formed. He had met my father exactly once at our wedding, and Raymond had been quiet the whole day, and Gerald had filed him accordingly. Marcus stood up. Mr. Voss, I. Sit down, Marcus, my father said. Marcus sat down. Raymond, Gerald said warmly, extending a hand. We weren't expecting. I know you weren't, my father said. He didn't take the hand. He reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket, and I watched his fingers find what they were looking for. A folder, manila, thicker than it looked, with a brass brad bent slightly from age. He took it out slowly and set it on the table in front of him without opening it yet. Then he took out his phone. He opened an application I recognized, the Harmon County Property Records portal, and navigated to a document while Gerald watched with the careful expression of a man trying to determine whether he should still be smiling. My father turned the phone screen outward and set it flat on the table beside the folder. Then he opened the folder and laid it flat. Do you know what that is? He asked Gerald. Gerald looked at it. His face did not change immediately. Then, that appears to be a deed. It is, my father said. Recorded at Harmon County Courthouse 15 years ago. The property at 4 Creston Mill Road, the house Marcus inherited partial interest in from his grandfather, was purchased from Harmon Savings with a private loan. That loan, $18,340, was extended by me, not a bank, because your father-in-law at the time needed the financing closed in 9 days and no institution could move that fast. The deed transfer was contingent on full repayment. The loan was never repaid. The contingency was never cleared. He looked at Gerald steadily. The property is in a legal gray that your family has been sitting on for 15 years. Nora didn't know. I didn't tell her because I didn't think it was her burden to carry. But it exists. The room was very quiet. Gerald said, "Raymond, this is hardly the time or the—" "You used the word ungrateful," my father said. "In front of 400 people. About my daughter. After your son struck her." He paused. "I want you to think carefully about the next sentence you say." Gerald thought carefully. The warmth left his face in increments, like heat leaving a room through a window left open. "I did what any father would do," Gerald finally said. "Marcus has given Nora a great deal." "She gave more," my father said. Simply. No flourish. "This is a family matter," Gerald said. "Between Marcus and Nora. The property question is a separate." "It's the same question," my father said. "It's always been the same question. What does a person owe, and to whom?" He picked up the folder. "I'm not here to file anything tonight. I'm here because my daughter called me. But the record exists, and now you know I know it exists, and that's enough for tonight." He looked at Marcus then, just looked for a moment without speaking. Marcus did not say anything. "Nora," my father said. "Yes," I said. "Come on, then." I picked up my clutch. At the door I stopped. I turned back to the room once, not to Marcus, not to Gerald, just to the room. 400 people who had laughed. I didn't speak. I turned and walked out. Gerald called after me, "This isn't over, Nora." I kept walking. That was 14 months ago. The folder sits on the corner of my desk now, still in its county-stamped envelope, the brass brad still bent at the same angle my father never bothered to straighten. I don't open it. I don't need to. It isn't a weapon. It's a record, and records don't require maintenance, they just require existing. The property question was resolved quietly through attorneys. The contingency deed was examined by a title company and determined to have cloud status. The Calloway family's attorney contacted my father's attorney 6 weeks after Dellwood. A settlement on the $18,340 was reached, with interest totaling $647,000 when factoring the appraised appreciation on the encumbered asset across 15 years. My father donated the figure to the County Land Trust. He told me this matter-of-factly on the phone the way he told me most things. Marcus sent a text message 4 months after the anniversary dinner. It said, "I think we should talk." I read it. I set the phone face down on my desk. I picked up a case file. I didn't respond. There was nothing in me that considered it an open question. Gerald sent a letter, actual paper, through an attorney, requesting that I consider the family's position with discretion. I read it once and put it in a file labeled correspondence. No action required. I work the same job I've always worked. I live in an apartment on the east side of Findlay with 2 good windows and a kitchen I use every morning. I run the Creston Mill Assessment District now, which is a modest promotion that came through the normal channels, earned in the normal way, meaning no one's father arranged it and no one's husband's reputation attached to it. It's mine the straightforward way. That matters to me more than I would have expected. Gerald once said I had been along for the ride. I think about that sometimes. I think about what it costs a person to believe that, and what it costs the person they say it to. My own father came for dinner last month. He sat at my kitchen table and ate the soup I made and talked about a fencing project he was finishing, and at the end of the night he looked around the apartment the same way he looked at my face that night in the banquet hall, carefully once and then with a nod that meant this is correct. I think about the laugh sometimes. The one from table 7 that started the rest. I don't hold it like a grievance. I hold it like information. It told me exactly which room I'd been standing in and for how long and how little standing in it had ever cost the people who watched me do it. The folder stays on my desk. Its brad is bent. It has always been enough. If any part of this story sat with you, if you've ever worked quietly while someone else took the credit or stood in a room that laughed, share it with someone who'd understand. Sometimes the right story finds the right person at exactly the right moment.